Okay, so welcome to our World Oceans Day talk for Explore Your Shore. This marks the launch of our Rocky Shore Safari, which is our latest of 4 surveys for the Explore Your Shore project. And what we're going to talk about today is our Rocky Shore Safari and also some of the animals and plants you might expect to encounter on rocky shores around Ireland. Explore Your Shore is a project of the National Biodiversity Data Centre, and it's funded by the Environmental Protection Agency. So what are the project goals? Well, Explore Your Shore is designed to build a baseline data set for intertidal species, so plants and animals, really seaweeds and invertebrates that you might find on rocky shores around the coastline. At the moment, if you look at the National Biodiversity Data Centre data set, we've very few or rather few marine species records, especially on the intertidal. So we're looking to improve that record and improve our knowledge of the distribution of species around the Irish coastline. And we're also looking to explore marine species as bioindicators of climate change and water quality. And the project also has a role in raising public awareness of both intertidal biodiversity and the challenges facing them. So our main way we interact with you guys in the public is through our Explore Your Shore website, so exploreyourshore.ie. And on that website, you will find everything that you need to know about the project. You'll find all our surveys under Explore Your Shore surveys, our partner surveys under Marine Biodiversity surveys, and you'll find out about project partners and also resources, so identification resources and links to good sources for those. The survey itself is broken down into 4 separate surveys. So we have Seashore Spotter, the Big Beach Biodiversity Survey, Seashore Snapshots, and the Rocky Shore Safari, which we're launching today. We also have partner surveys, which I'll highlight in a minute. Seashore Spotter then is our survey that's designed really for collecting casual records. So it's designed for anyone and everyone who's out and about on the seashore and spots something and wants to record that and submit their record to the National Biodiversity Data Centre. You can just, using our online data form at exploreyyourshore.ie, or indeed using the biodiversity app that the National Biodiversity Data Centre has, you can submit those records with a photo to us for identification once they're validated, and then we will then submit them to our mapping system. The Big Beach Biodiversity Survey, which we launched last year, is focused on surveying mainly bivalves, so marine bivalves. So they're the ones with 2 halves to the shell, things like mussels and oysters. It's a timed effort survey where we ask you to go and survey along essentially the high water level on a beach and record as many different species as you can. You submit these data with photos, preferably, or using our online web form, and that data then again gets validated. We really need you to submit with photos because of the sheer diversity of species that are on the intertidal. So if you just submit records without photos, it's very hard for us to validate them. So take a good photo and submit it with your record. On the Big Beach Biodiversity Survey, we also record marine flotsam and jetsam. So what's that? It can be anything from seaweeds to marine species, marine snail egg cases, to a whole range of other stuff that washes up on the shore. Okay, a lot of what you're recording is actually dead, so it's the shells, it's the remains of the animals, but it also tells us still tells us something about the distribution of those species because those shells have come from the adjacent sea. So it's a strange one in that we're asking you, in that case, to mostly record dead animals. I can put a plug in at this stage for a new marine bivalve shell swatch. So this was launched last week and it's hot off the press, and it has details of about 48 different marine bivalve species or shell types that you'll find on the coast around Ireland. And very handy, you can stick it in your pocket and bring it with you, and it'll help you to identify all those shells you've been looking at for years but not really had much of an idea of what they were. That's available for sale now on the National Biodiversity website. That's biodiversityireland.ie. The other survey we have is Seashore Snapshots. This is really aimed at recording sessile species. What do I mean by sessile species? Well, I mean by species that kind of stick to rocks and don't move by and large. Species like limpets and species like barnacles. What we ask you to do there is we have a couple of printable frames, so just an A4 sheet that you can print out the frame and cut out a usable frame for using on the shore. And that frame means that we get you to focus in at enough resolution on those animals so we can identify them for the pictures you send in. So if you took a picture of barnacles or limpets from far away, we'd know there are barnacles or limpets, but we wouldn't necessarily be able to identify the species. By using the frame and making sure you take a picture of the whole frame, then we know we're going to get a picture that's close in enough for us to identify those species. We're asking you to take 5 shots from the middle and the lower shore and to submit those online via our online form. Again, all details are on exploreyourshore.ie. And that's it. You don't have to do anything else. You don't have to identify which species you're looking at. We'll do all that in due course. And the other thing we'll do is we'll work out densities in terms of percentage cover for these species and look at what those might tell us about climate change and about water quality in the local area. But on to today's survey, the Rocky Shore Safari. This, as I say, is the 4th survey in our suite of surveys for exploreyourshore.ie. Again, it's a timed survey effort where we're asking you to give up about an hour of your time to go and survey your local rocky shore. As you can see from the picture here, what we're asking you to do is survey a box, an imaginary box, about 10 meters wide, no bigger than that really, because it's quite a lot of ground to cover, running from the upper shore right down to the water's edge. So we're asking you to do this at low tide, because that's the best time to see the widest variety of plant and animal species. And we're asking you to spend roughly equal amounts of time, or at least 20 minutes in each area. So 20 minutes in the upper shore, 20 minutes in the middle shore, 20 minutes in the lower shore. You can spend longer than that as long as you record the time you spend in each area. We are asking you to search for the big 30, which is essentially 30 rocky shore plant and animal species that are easy, or we think anyway, are easy to identify because they're quite classic and quite distinct species. There's 30 of them, not that we expect you to find 30 on every shore, but to give you a good mix of species. Some of these species are really common and you'll definitely find them. Some of these species are not so common, but they're really easy to identify. Other ones are very good indicators for climate change or for water quality. So if there's a mix of species, you are guaranteed to find at least one of these species on every rocky shore, unless it's been sandblasted the day before. And it's just to encourage you to hunt down, because if you just walk over a rocky shore, you'll see lots of seaweed, but you won't necessarily see much else. But if you dig down into it, if you look under rocks, in crevices, underneath the seaweed, you'll find a lot more species. So this is a bit of a treasure hunt to encourage you to look. You can record these species then, you take a photo and submit them on the online form, but you can also record and submit records of any species you find. It's not just the big 30, you record any species you find during your survey at all. If you can identify it and take a picture of it, you can submit it to us. Explore Your Shore also has a number of partner surveys surveys. So these are marine biodiversity surveys that have been running in Ireland for various lengths of time. Some of them have been running for many, many years. So if I think of the, for example, the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group have been running whale and dolphin recording scheme in Ireland since 1991. And other projects have been going on even longer than that. Coastwatch, I think, started in the 80s, so it's got a very long and distinguished record. And for these different groups, some of them tend to have different foci. So you have jellyfish, basking sharks, whales, dolphins, sea searches for divers. Coastwatch is an eco audit of the shore, and the purse searches for shark and ray egg cases. So try out those surveys and give it a go. There's a huge coastline in Ireland. One survey isn't going to cover everything. So the more data we get, the better it is all round in terms of building a good baseline data set for Ireland. Okay, so I'll next bring you through some of our rocky shore species. So these are the species you are most likely to find on the rocky shores around our coastline. There's a whole range of them. What I've tried to do here is pick out the ones that are most commonly found. So we'll start you with the relatively easy ones to find and identify. Don't be scared of identifying a rocky shore species. There are a plethora of species on any stretch of coastline in Ireland. You will find hundreds of different species, both seaweeds and intertidal invertebrate species. We don't expect you to know all of them. That would be crazy. But we do ask you to start with identifying the easy species, the ones that are classic and easy to identify. And then as you do that, you'll work up your knowledge. You'll begin to see species you don't recognize. And as you dig about in the ID books, you might start to recognize those in future. So it's something you don't go out on day one and expect to identify everything. And the survey is designed to accommodate that. I suppose the other thing to mention before I go into the species ID is that part of what we're doing here is trying to build a good baseline data set for Ireland for distributions of intertidal species. Why do we want to do that? Well, a lot of it lies in the fact that we can't understand how things are changing on our coastline unless we have a good baseline data set. At the moment, for many species, many intertidal species, we don't have that. So we don't know their full distribution. We don't have sufficient records for that. For terrestrial species, for land species, we do have that in most cases because there's a strong record of recording land species in Ireland. Not so marine species, oddly enough, even though we're an island nation. So if we can build a good baseline data set of what things look like now and distributions look like now, then in 10 years' time or in 20 years' time, we'll be on a much better footing to look at that again and understand how things have changed or not changed, as the case may be. And typically changes are driven by things like climate change or like water quality or habitat quality. So it's all of interest in a conservation context. So a little bit more then on species. So let's start with the seaweeds, not because I'm biased towards the seaweeds, but it's generally the first thing that people notice when they go down the rocky shore is the diversity of species. Some people look at the rocky shore and they just see seaweeds, but not all seaweeds are the same. So the more you look at them, the more you'll see the differences between them. I suppose if you're talking about surveying a shore at low tide, some of the most prominent seaweeds that you'll see at the water's edge are the kelps. And the kelps are very large seaweeds. Some of for example, Cuvie here is a kelp species. You know, when you hold it up, it can be almost as tall as a person. And when you're underwater, you're able to dive underneath these kelp forests. So they're very large seaweed species. Some of the most common kelp species, I suppose Cuvie would be one of the most commonly found kelp species and one of the most distinctive kelp species. You will find it at low tide, at extreme low tide, along the water's edge. So you won't find it growing on the intertidal, but just below at the extreme of the low tide, you'll find Cuvie growing. You notice this in the water because it tends to stand fairly upright at low tide. This is because the stalk is stiff and it doesn't bend very easily. So it tends to kind of stand upright with a big frond on the top of it, as you can see in the picture here. And indeed, if you find that kelp on the shore, washed up dead, one easy way to identify it is to try bending it. If it doesn't bend easily, and if it snaps when you try and bend it in two, what you've got is Cuvie in your hand. The stalk is also wrinkled, and the stalks tend to be covered in marine growth. So both plants and animals live on the stalks of Cuvie. And quite a plethora of plants and animals live on them and survive on them and rely on them for habitat. So if you look at this underwater picture of Cuvie growing beneath the waves, you can see that it's absolutely covered in all sorts of creepy crawlies, marine species, smaller seaweeds, and that is a habitat, and it's a very rich habitat. Think of it as the kind of rainforest of the underwater world. And it's a habitat for juvenile fish species and for a whole range of invertebrate species, and a very important one to protect. Another species of kelp is Oarweed. But you may notice that Oarweed lies flat at low tide. So it's very bendy. It can't support itself once the tide goes out, and it lays over flat. So that's quite a distinctive difference between it and Cuvie. Again, you'll find it on the lower shore right at the water's edge and growing into the water or under the water. The stalk, if you find it washed up dead, if you pick it up and try and bend it in half, it will bend. It's extremely flexible and it tends not to snap if you bend the stalk in two. The stalks are generally smooth and free of growth. Not always, but by and large, they're smooth and free of growth. As you can see, most of those stalks have nothing growing on them. They're quite shiny and smooth looking. So that's Oarweed. Another kelp that you'll find on the lower shore, in the extreme lower shore, but also in rock pools, is a kelp called Dabberlocks. It's a strange and wonderful name, but it's a very easy kelp to identify. It has this very distinct and large midrib, which tends to be a kind of a, what would you call it, a light green, yellowish green color. And that's surrounded by a ribbon-like frond. The whole frond and midrib gives it a spear-like appearance. And this can be a couple of feet long, so it's quite a large kelp. And again, you will tend to find it in lower shore rock pools and again at the water's edge, growing on the water's edge. If we go back up the shore then, and we look at the different seaweeds we might find as we walk from around the rocky shore, we'll find a lot of wrack species. So wrack species are the classic kind of seaweed that you see on the rocky shore. This is Bladderwrack, which a lot of people would be familiar with. It's an extremely common species. It's got a distinct midrib, and it grows in either tufts or clusters on the midshore, or it can grow pretty much unbroken in blankets of seaweed along the midshore on a rocky shore. The absolute giveaway for its identification is it has paired air bladders, and these air bladders are designed to support it in the water. So seaweeds, although they're not true plants, they still photosynthesize to make their food. To do that, then they need sunlight, and to get the best sunlight, they need to support their fronds upright in the water to get good exposure to sunlight and to nutrients. So they absorb their nutrients directly from the water. They don't have a root, but they have a hold fast just to hold them onto the rocks. So for Bladderwrack, look for a distinct midrib and paired air bladders, and that's the classic identification features for this species. They're also a great habitat for other species, so you should lift them up when you find them, have a look underneath the fronds, and you'll probably find a lot of sea snails, anemones, and other species growing under there because it's a nice moist habitat. If you're looking on the upper shore, then the classic upper shore seaweed is channeled wrack. And channeled wrack is a very tough cookie. Because it grows on the extreme upper shore of the rocky shore, it gets exposed to the air and the sunlight for, extended periods for several hours at a time. And it's designed, it's evolved to withstand extreme exposure to air. So it can survive out of water for up to 8 days. It can lose most of its moisture. And indeed, you'll find that sometimes it grows in tufts and rocks on the upper shore. You'll find it sometimes looking dead. It's dried out looking, it's brittle. If you actually pick it up and scrunch it in your hand, it'll fall apart. But it's still, even in that state, capable of coming back to life. It's capable of losing almost all of its moisture. And yet when the tide comes back in, it'll rejuvenate and spring back to life and start doing what it's doing. It's got these classic in-rolled channeled fronds, which are a mechanism to help it preserve moisture, and they're also a classic ID feature for the seaweed. And it has evenly forked branching in the fronds. So quite a tough cookie on the upper shore. It's so evolved to surviving on the upper shore, it actually dies if it's submerged in seawater for more than 6 hours at a time. So it really is designed for living exposed for much of the day. Egg wrack is another mid-shore species, along with bladderwrack. Egg wrack and bladderwrack are two of the classic mid-shore seaweeds. Egg wrack is again another very distinctive seaweed species. You see that it has these strap-like fronds, which are quite leathery when you pick them up and feel them. They're quite tough. And it has very large single air bladders along the fronds. Again, the purpose of those air bladders is to keep them upright in the water and enable them to access sunlight and to photosynthesize. They have a regular forked branching, and there's nothing else really on the intertidal that looks like egg wrack. Sometimes on egg wrack, you'll also see the smaller red seaweed that you can see in this picture. This is the seaweed that grows on egg wrack. It doesn't take any nutrients from the egg wrack, it just uses as a surface to grow on. And it's a species called Vertebrata lanosa. Don't worry about that. Just be aware of the fact that you will quite often see this red seaweed, this red tufty seaweed growing on egg wrack. Another classic upper shore seaweed, along with channeled wrack, is spiraled wrack. Spiral wrack, as the name implies, has a spiral or a twist to it. So it doesn't have air bladders. Like channeled wrack, it doesn't have air bladders. The things you see, the blobby things in the picture aren't air bladders. They're reproductive bodies, so they're the fruiting bodies of the seaweed. If you pop them, there's no air in them. What you'll get is a jelly-like substance which contains the gametes. It has a distinct midrib, like many of the wrack species do. No air bladders, but it has this distinctive spiral twist in the fronds, and it drapes down over the rocks. So you'll see it draping down the rocks, almost in curls, draping over the rocks with these spiral twists to them. So quite an easy one to identify, and a classic seaweed, as I say, of the upper shore. Horned wrack is another wrack species that you will find on the mid-shore. It's nowhere near as common as either egg wrack or bladderwrack, but it's an interesting one because it's one that's quite easy to identify when you do find it. It's got a distinct midrib, as I say, like most of the wracks do, but it has these strange elongated air pockets. So it doesn't have bladders as such, but it has these elongated air pockets along the fronds towards the tips. It's quirky, not quirky, but it's different to the other wracks in that it favors areas near brackish water. So you'll tend to find it where freshwater and saltwater mix, or in rock pools or around rock pools towards the upper shore where there might be a mix of freshwater and saltwater in those rock pools. So an easy one to identify, horned wrack. A classic lower shore seaweed then would be dulse. So dulse is one of the many red seaweed types. So seaweeds are broken into three groups. There's red algae or red seaweeds, brown seaweeds, which would include the wracks and the kelps, even though I know they don't look very brown, but that's the name given to them. They're kind of a browny green. And there's also green seaweeds, which are vivid green. So dulse is one of the red seaweeds. The red seaweeds are by far the most diverse group of seaweeds. There's hundreds of species. A lot of them look very similar. They're the group of seaweeds that people struggle most to identify. However, dulse is a relatively easy one to identify. It has these membrane-like or leathery blades. So depending on where it grows, the blade will grow thicker or thinner. On the lower shore, in amongst the wracks on the lower shore, they tend to have fairly leathery blades on them. If they're growing on the stalks of kelp, which they do, they tend to have much finer membrane-like blades. They're a seaweed that most people will be familiar with because they're one of the most frequently eaten seaweeds around the coast of Ireland. A lot of people will have tasted dulse. Quite often it's been traditionally harvested by hand, dried in the sun, and people eat it as a snack or they add it into foods of various descriptions. So it's, all seaweeds, pretty much all seaweeds are edible. They all contain very high levels of vitamins and minerals and are very healthy foods by and large. And dulse is one of the most commonly used. It's also a classic lower shore seaweed. If we come away from the seaweeds then, and we look at some of the other critters that live on the seashore. So the seaweeds are the plants. They're not true plants, they're algae, but for our purposes, we'll call them plants. The other thing you'll find on the intertidal then are the intertidal invertebrates, or creepy crawlies, as you might know them better by. I suppose the classic intertidal invertebrate is the Beadlet Anemone. And Beadlet Anemones you will find on pretty much every rocky shore around the Irish coastline. They're a real classic. Your granny might have called them bloodsuckers. They don't suck your blood. They're red, and the tentacles are, they feel sticky when you touch them because an enemy is trying to grab you. So they feel a bit sticky when you touch them. I suppose that's where they got the name bloodsuckers from, because they tend to latch onto your finger if you touch them. I should explain, beadlet anemones are animals. They look like flowers, they look like plants, but they are animals. They're found all over the shore, from upper shore down to the water's edge. They thrive in rock pools, especially anywhere on the shoreline. They come classically in red, bright red like this. However, you can also find them in an orange or a green form. They're short tentacles, which, as I say, if you touch them, they will latch onto you and you'll feel it kind of being sticky. If you poke them enough, which you probably shouldn't, but they will retract, and you'll quite often see them, like the second photo shows you, on the rocky shore, retracted, and essentially they look like gummy sweets. They don't bear too much of a resemblance to the open form of the animal. I suppose everyone's favourite beadlet anemone fact is that beadlet anemones, indeed all sea anemones, have the mouth in the exact same place as their bottom. So food goes in and out through the same passage. The kids always love that one as an anemone fact. But a really easy one to identify and record. Another sea anemone species that's classically found on the rocky shore is the Snakelocks Anemone. It's found on the mid to low shore and especially in rock pools. There's two color forms. There's this amazing green form with purple tips, which is stunning to look at if you get it in the right sunlight and if you see it in a rock pool. There's also a brownish color form, which on the intertidal I think tends to be a bit more common, or certainly the intertidal ones that I've found tend to be a bit more of this brownish form, still with purpley, pinkish tips to it. You tend to find maybe the green form just under the at the water's edge, just under the water or in shallow water. They have long tentacles which generally don't retract if you poke them. They can retract, but generally they don't bother. So they don't react in the same way as the Beadlet Anemone. And they look very different, and the tentacles are much longer than the Beadlet Anemone. They're a good indicator. They're a kind of a warmer water species. You'd find Snakelocks Anemone right down to the Mediterranean. So they're a warmer water species. So they're a fairly good indicator for climate change as they spread northwards. One that's worth mentioning in terms of sea snails then is the blue-rayed limpet, because it's such an easy limpet species to identify. It's found on the extreme lower shore. Generally, you will find it attached to the leaves, to the fronds, of kelp species, where they graze over the fronds of the kelp. You're looking at something in this picture that's the size of the tip of your finger. It's about the size of your fingernail, a little bit bigger maybe. And they have these dazzling blue rays, iridescent blue rays on the younger animals. The older animals tend to be duller, and the blue rays are not as distinctive. You find them a lot perhaps washed up with kelp in the winter storms. They seem to burrow into the stalks of the kelps as older animals. The shell is more classic limpet shaped in the older animals. But if you turn over the dead shell and look inside it, it has this iridescent purple color, which is very distinctive as well. So that's blue-rayed limpet. Common limpet then, which is one species that everyone will be familiar with. I think none of us have gone to the beach and not walked over a limpet or used them as a foothold, or if you're fishing, knock them off and use the unfortunate animals as bait for your fishing. They're found over the entire shore. They're very distinctive looking animal, so you can't miss them on the rocks. However, identifying them is quite tricky, because from external features, from shell features, it's not always obvious what species you're dealing with. They can also grow in different forms. So limpets growing on exposed shores won't grow as high, won't grow as tall as limpets on sheltered shores. So they can look quite different depending on where they're growing. Really, for identification, you need to flip them over, and you can remove them using a penknife or something like that without harming them, and look underneath at the animal's foot. And generally, for limpet identification, you go on the foot color and how much of the rim of the shell you can see in the animal when you flip it over. Probably a bit more than we need to go into now, but we do encompass limpets and limpet data collection in the Seashore Snapshots survey. So there, all we do is ask you to go out and take pictures of limpets and submit them, so you don't have to worry about identification at that stage. So if it's a bit tough to identify them on the shore for the Rocky Shore survey, you can always get involved in the Seashore Snapshot survey. We have a few different species of intertidal limpet in Ireland, so that's where it gets a bit tricky. The dog whelk then is another classic of the intertidal. It's a very distinctive sea snail. It's found on the mid to lower shore, and it's extremely common and extremely abundant where it does occur. It's also, well, I suppose in identification terms, it's got this very pointed spire. It generally comes in white, but you can get different forms. You can get striped coloration on dog whelks. Depends on local environmental conditions, what color they grow, and they have these kind of ridges or corrugations on the shell as well. Interesting thing, excuse me, about the dog whelk is it's a top predator of the intertidal. And quite often, if you're out collecting seashells, which many people do, you'll find these seashells, like these ones down in the corner here, with perfectly drilled holes in them. Now, that's not because someone's been on the rocky shore the day before with a Black & Decker drill. It's because these animals have all been predated by a whelk, and quite often by a dog whelk. What happens, and this is a bit of a gruesome tale, is the dog whelk will crawl onto the snail, onto the bivalve shell, and generally it is bivalves they predate on, things like mussels, and in these cases you've got banded wedge shells. They'll climb onto the shell, and using an extremely sharp and strong tongue covered in little radula, which drill into the shell, they'll drill a little hole into the bivalve shell. They'll inject digestive juices, and then they'll rasp the whole lot out through the hole like some sort of really awful slush puppy. They leave behind them a dead bivalve with a perfectly drilled hole, and they go off for their next meal. Some indication of just how successful they are is just how many bivalve shells that are washed up on the shore have these perfectly drilled holes in them. So these are a top predator of the intertidal. Flat periwinkles are another one. If you like your seashells and you like looking and collecting seashells, quite often you'll have come across flat periwinkles. They're a bit of a tricky species because they're actually two different species. I'm not going to fry your head with Latin names, but you've got Littorina obtusata or Littorina fabialis. All you need to know really is flat top shells live up to their name in that they don't have a spire. So the shell lacks a spire. That's why it gets the name flat top shells. They come in a mind-boggling array of different colors and shapes and patterns, from reds to yellows to stripes and all sorts of zigs. And in terms of the two different species, obtusata or fabialis, all we really need to know is that obtusata tends to live on the mid-shore, whereas the other species, fabialis, tends to live on the lower shore. Quite often, though, if you submit a record of this, we'll just record them as a collective two-species group because they're so difficult. Even the experts find them very difficult to identify. The common periwinkle, then, is a classic of the intertidal. It's extremely common where it occurs, and sometimes you will literally find hundreds or thousands of these animals just clustered together in every nook and crack and crevice on the seashore. They're edible, so they're the edible periwinkle is the other name for them, and there's quite a big industry in collecting these. Mostly the market is in France, but in Ireland as well. And they're found across the whole shore, from the upper shore right down to the water's edge. And they taste a bit like mussels, I suppose. I'm not a great fan of them, but they are edible and they are quite tasty. And they are extremely common, quite easy to identify. You see the shell has kind of a blunt spire, not as pointed as in the dog whelk. So, and again, they're really common where they do occur. Another kind of pretty sea snail species you'll find on the intertidal is the flat top shell. These are flat top shells. They look a little bit like turbans. They've a flattened appearance in that they do have a spire, but it's extremely flat. They have these classic colored purple rays running out from the spire down across the shell. And if you flip them over and look in the center of the shell, you'll almost always see a hole. It's like, again, someone has drilled a hole up the center of the shell. It's just the way the animal grows, but that central hole is quite classic for the flat top shell. Again, you'll find them on the whole shore, but particularly in rock pools. The thick top shell is the cousin of the flat top shell, much bigger animal, much bigger, well, in terms of, you know, you can get them growing up to about thumb size maybe. It's got its classic identification feature, I suppose, is it has this tooth in the shell opening. It doesn't look much like a tooth, says you, but it's the only species that really has that notch or that bump in the shell opening, the only top shell species. So it's also called the tooth top shell. And the shell itself has these kind of classic zigzag markings, which are usually quite easy to see and help with the identification. It's a mid-shore species on rocky shores. This little critter is the broad-clawed porcelain crab. It's a bit of a tongue twister to say, the broad-clawed porcelain crab. You'll find it on the mid to low shore, but mostly on the lower shore, underneath rocks and boulders on the lower shore. They have a flattened, I'll just run back through this if I can. They have a kind of flattened appearance, so the whole animal looks squat. The claws are flattened. They have these quite prominent antennae coming out of the top of the animal. And the claws are broad, as the name suggests, broad-clawed, and they also have hairs on them, or some version of hairs. So they look like hairy, broad-clawed crabs. They're very small. Think about the size of your thumbnail. So very small, but quite a lot of them on the lower shore underneath rocks. Just a quick mention of this beastie I'm pointing out here is the grey topshell. It's another topshell species. I'll not go too much into it, but just be aware of it. The crabs then, another brown crab species is the brown crab. This is the classic crab. It's the one you'll have if you go to a restaurant and order crab. This is generally the one you'll be given. It has this classic pie crust shell with the pie crust edge to it. Beautiful green eyes and large black pincers. You'll find them on the lower shore, mostly juveniles on the lower shore, dug in to sediment underneath rocks. They grow though to quite a large size. I mean, if you spread your two hands out together, they'll grow to that kind of size in deeper water once they get into onto sandy bottom and deeper waters. They have the ability, which you wouldn't think looking at them, to move quite long distances. I think the Irish record for movement detected in a brown crab is 270 kilometers. So a brown crab walked along the seafloor 270 kilometers, not in one day, not in 1 week, but over a period of years. But it's still a massive distance for such a small animal to go. The classic shore crab is the shore crab. So the shore crab is ubiquitous on pretty much every rocky shore. It's a classic crab you'll find. You can almost be guaranteed that you'll find this species on every rocky shore survey you do. You'll find it all over the shore, mostly hidden beneath rocks and hiding in rock pools, but you may also find it underneath seaweed. The classic identification features of the shore crab: it has 5 serrations or ridges or teeth either side of the eyes, either side of the shell. There you can see these 5 kind of serrations, and then in between the eyes there's 3 rounded lobes. So think of those 5 teeth either side of the eyes and 3 rounded lobes in between the eyes, and you'll have in your hand a shore crab. A hermit crab is another quite common one found on rocky shores, mostly in rock pools. You'll see them scurrying around. What you'll see generally is you'll see a sea snail or a common limpet that's moving far too fast, and it's not a common limpet, it's a shore crab that's taken up residence in a common limpet shell. They do have their own exoskeleton, but for protection they use this cast off shells of snail species. Quite commonly the common periwinkle, shells are quite often used. They're classic little beasties and very noticeable where you see them. Acorn barnacles then, another species that occur on pretty much every shore. Barnacle species, everyone's seen barnacles. They cover rocks on the intertidal from the mid to lower shore. I think that's wrong. Mid to lower shore, that should be. You'll see them blanketing the rocks. They are in fact not snails as many people think they are, but they're a relation of the crab. So inside is a little beastie that's related to the crabs. If you've watched them, if you go snorkeling or something like that, watch them at low tide, you'll see this little hand-like feature come out, and it grabs bits and pieces of food from the surrounding water and scoops them in. It has 2 different types of plates, and this is how do we identify them. It has plates around the rim and has central plates that is essentially the trapdoor inside which the animal lives. They're very tricky species to identify, so again, Seashore Snapshots is a good way of getting involved in recording barnacles without necessarily having to identify them on the spot. The common prawn is another commonly encountered seashore, rocky shore species in rock pools. Almost every rock pool of size will have a common prawn living within it somewhere. Although people tend to treat them as a single species, there's in fact a few species of prawns that look very similar. You tell them apart by the teeth or serrations on their rostrum. It's probably more than you need to know, but if you record them as common prawn, that's good enough. They can be recorded as a collective group. Common starfish then, another classic lower shore species on the rocky shore. They eke their living, well, they have 5 arms, go through the description first, 5 arms, classic star-shaped starfish. They have an orange body with these spines that grow in rows on the upper arms. They eke out their living by eating bivalves, things like mussels, and they use water power essentially to heave the 2 valves in the mussel apart. That's the same kind of gruesome story as for the dog whelk. Once they heave the mussel apart wide enough, they insert their stomach into the poor unfortunate mussel, digest it, and scoop it back out. But you find them not too frequently on the lower shore, but if you look in the right spots or if you hit the right shore, you will find them. Another species of the lower shore is the shore urchin, which is related to the starfish in that it has 5-way symmetry. It's a grazer. It goes along feeding on detritus and on algae and things like that. You will find it generally wedged into cracks and crevices on the lower shore, waiting for the tide to come back in. It has these greenish coloured spines with violet coloured tips. It's quite small, about the size of your fist or smaller. So it's not the classic big edible urchin that people tend to think of when they think of sea urchins. Honeycomb Reef then, if you're lucky enough to have it on your rocky shore, is a distinctive species. The tubes are built from sand and shell fragments, so it's actually a worm species that builds these tubes to live in. It's found on the lower shore, and the tubes that are built are shaped like the honeycomb of bees, or bees' honeycomb. It's actually a protected species or a protected habitat under the EU Habitats Directive, so it's quite an important one. They don't take well to being stood on, so if you do find it, try your very best not to stand on the reef. In terms of fish species then, butterfish is a classic intertidal fish species. You find it mostly on the lower shore underneath rocks. You can find it higher up, maybe in the mid-shore region, either under rocks or in rock pools. And they can survive for quite a long period out of the water. They keep their gills covered in moisture, in water, and they can survive right throughout the turn of the tide until the tide returns back in, and then they'll come out to forage. So mostly you'll find them hiding out under rocks. The butterfish has spots on its back, 10 spots, and it's quite a hard one to miss because it's classic eel-like shape, even though it's not an eel. And those 10 spots. The common blenny is another species you will find on the intertidal, again on the lower shore, hiding out under rocks. Again, sometimes you'll find it on the mid-shore, depending on whether conditions are right or not. They'll hide out under those rocks again until the tide comes in and can survive quite a long period out of water that way. And then once the tide comes back in, they'll start scooching out and foraging again. You'll also find it active on rock pools on the intertidal. So that's a run through, I suppose, of some of the classic intertidal species that you might find on a rocky shore safari. Again, don't be freaked out if we've covered too much in this, or if you think there's so many species I can't cope. Indeed, in our recent seaweed splash that we did for Biodiversity Week, we had 150 different species recorded in that week by people out and about on the seashore. So there's a lot of species there to learn and to get used to. But start with the classic species, start with the easy to identify species, and then build up your knowledge from there. Be aware that almost anything can turn up on the intertidal. Indeed, Catherine certainly found this beastie, I think it was at Sandy Cove, hanging around in a rock pool, waiting for the tide to come back in. This is a curled octopus. So it's part of the pleasure of doing intertidal surveys, is you really don't know what's going to turn up when and where. In terms of resources to help you on your mission to learn more about intertidal species and learn species ID, there's a few that I can point you towards. This one's out of print, Sea and Shore Life of Britain and Northwest Europe, but you can still buy it online. Paperback copies of it are still affordable and online. It's a really good book and a really good introductory guide to life on the seashore, on the rocky shore. There's Ireland Seashore, a field guide, which will contain all the classic species you'll find, not just on the rocky shore, but also on sandy shores, by Lucy Taylor and Emma Nicholson. If you want to learn more about your seaweeds, a great book to get is the Sea Search Guide to Seaweeds of Britain and Ireland, which contains all the seaweeds you're going to want to know about, I suppose, in really easily accessible form without frying your head. So Seaweeds of Britain and Ireland contains all the common seaweeds and a good guide to some of the less well-known seaweed species as well. And finally, there's a great little book called Essential Guide to Beachcombing and the Strand Line. And that's really good for stuff that's washed up, really. It was designed for species that you might find during, as you walk along the beach, but it covers a lot of the species you would find on the rocky shore as well. If you want to find out more, if you want to get involved, please visit exploreyourshore.ie. On there, you will find all the information you need to know to get involved. Further information on different resources available and links to our partner surveys as well. And any news and updates we have, we'll be adding on there. Any other events we have, we'll be adding on there as well. And also, check out our Facebook page at Explore Your Shore. It's particularly useful. Again, we send out regular social media messages on news and updates and information. Well, it's also, if you find a species that you can't identify, it's a good place to put that. So you can submit your unknown beastie or plant to us at Explore Your Shore on Facebook, and we'll do our level best to identify it. Or if we can't, we'll find someone who can.